When it comes to the M100 Elan, two things immediately spring to mind. Its wedgy, square shape, and the fact it was the first Lotus to be front-wheel drive. Now initially, it looked like it would be a sales success, but only around 5,000 were sold. For many years, it's lived in the shadow of the Elise, but with Elise prices rocketing, do we need a reappraisal of the M100? Let's delve deeper and find out.
But first, our friends at Lancaster Insurance are running monthly giveaways. You can win all sorts, from experience days to tools, restaurant vouchers and tech. So click the link below at the end of the video to enter their latest competition.
So, the Elan M100. Of course, it revived the famous Elan name that we all loved from the 60s. But in two-seater form, that car had disappeared in 1973, and come the early 80s, the sports car industry was all but dead. If anyone was to revive it, it was going to be Lotus. Its initial plans in 1981 revolved around a front-engine, rear-wheel drive car in the traditional mould. But then, Toyota took a stake in the company, so it thought, we'll outsource the engine to Toyota. And that was when the beginnings of front-wheel drive were muted. The idea was to sell the car through Toyota dealers, so it would effectively be a Lotus Toyota or a Toyota Lotus. But in 1986, Lotus was taken over by General Motors, and those potential ties to Toyota were severed. They started with a new design, initially codenamed the X100, then the M100. It was designed in-house by Peter Stevens, who was famous for working with small budgets. The Elan was basically developed in a little over 3 years, which was impressive, but it wasn't really a rush job. Lotus really wanted the car to work in the US market, and so spent a lot of money getting it right. 37 million, that was the most they'd ever spent developing a car. And it's rumoured that the dashboard alone cost more than the entire XL programme. Instead of a Toyota engine, Lotus looked towards Isuzu, who it also had a stake in. So a 1.6 litre engine was chosen, 130 brake horsepower naturally aspirated form, or in the case of this Elan SE, 162 brake horsepower turbo unit. It had a steel backbone chassis with a fiberglass body, as per traditional Lotus, but the most interesting thing was that front-wheel drive. Now, there were concerns about torque steer because of all the hot hatches around at the time, but Lotus was confident it could overcome that, and it devised a very special front suspension. 2 wishbones on either side, mounted to what it called a compliance raft, which was basically an aluminium subframe. Now, the bushings for the wishbones were stiff, but the bushes that held the compliance raft to the chassis were much softer. It allowed for a soft and compliant ride without messing with the steering geometry. That helped with torque steer, and then it cornered really, really well for a front-wheel drive car. The early road testers were extremely impressed, and I'm pretty impressed now. And it's fair to say, with a turbo motor, this thing goes like Sting. The turbo was good for 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds, and a top speed of 137. The car was due to be released in August 1989, but there must have been a few tears shed at Hethel when earlier that year Mazda's MX5 had been unveiled to the world. While the M100 looked forward, Mazda's MX5 looked back to the original 1960s Elan, front engine, rear wheel drive. There were impressive pre-orders for the M100. Quite a few of those must have been cancelled when people got wind of the MX5. No, it wasn't as fast or as cleverly engineered, but it was around £5,000 cheaper, and of course, it was rear-wheel drive. And in a double whammy of bad timing, the M100, when it was launched in 1990, came out on the brink of a recession. People simply weren't willing to spend the extra buying the Elan. And of course, when times are tough, we always look back to the good times. And the MX5 looked back to the good times of the 1960s. That was a global success, whereas by 1992, after just 2 years, the M100 had been discontinued. Some say that GM's selling Lotus to Bugatti was heavily influenced by the fact the M100 was a bit of a sales flop. It was expensive to make, and Lotus weren't making a profit on it. But that wasn't the end of the story, not just yet anyway. There were still around 800 Isuzu engines left over. So Lotus, now under the ownership of Romano Artioli, owner of Bugatti, produced 800 more SEs. They had a little less power, around 155 horsepower, but some suspension tweaks were made, a few little styling updates, and that would see the Elan to the end of its days. Of course, the Elise then came out, and everyone rather forgot the Elan. The design was actually sold to Korea for Kia to make its own version. Instead of having the Isuzu engine, it had Kia's own 1.8 litre unit, and the rear lights, the Renault Alpine GTA units, were changed for Kia's own. Just over 1,000 were made until 1999, and that was it. No, the public didn't take it to their hearts. But should they have? Do you know what? I think they should have. This front-wheel drive handling is absolutely brilliant. You can see where all the engineering genius went. It does feel a bit like a hot hatch with no roof. Very, very easy, very predictable. And we know it's reliable. Those Isuzu engines can do 250,000 without a problem. But perhaps the problem is that it is a bit too safe. It doesn't have the theatre of rear-wheel drive. However, for most drivers, this is going to produce more than enough thrills. This car has actually really impressed me. There's a lot of received wisdom about the M100, but if you're in doubt and you get a chance, I say drive one. It might just change your mind. Oh, I love it. Of course, it's got pop-up headlights. What more could you want?
This video is proudly sponsored by Lancaster Insurance. Give them a call on 01480 400 889 for an insurance quote on your classic car. And don't forget to click the link below to enter their latest competition.